do you go to the left, change course, not do what Keir Starmer's promising to do, which is we're listening, but we're going to carry on and do the same things, but just do them quicker?
I think it's really important that we don't frame reform as this sort of brand new creation of the last 12 months. It isn't. It is the same party that has done so much damage under a different name to this country already.
This is the first time Farage is managing to be successful without that kind of adhesive. He has moved politically in terms of what he is offering, not on cultural questions and so on, but certainly on the question of the economy.
Populists don't invent grievances. They may exploit them, but the grievances are usually real. And therefore you're going to deal with it, whether it's stagnant wages or issues to do with anxiety over cultural change. And so for the progressive side of politics, how did we win? Well, first of all, we were always there in what I would call the common sense position on things like culture. But secondly, we had a strong desire to make change that was radical but also sensible.
This is Tony Blair speaking in California, not directly about the Labour government of Keir Starmer, but about progressive governments everywhere in the world and the problem they have in finding a message that can enthuse voters today when there seems to be so much anger and cynicism about politics in general.
He might not have been speaking to Keir Starmer, but he was certainly speaking about Keir Starmer. Right now, Labour is having what feels like a wobble. They don't know whether to shun reform, to embrace reform, or which policies they might have to change to do so. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And after the kind of shellacking, I think is the Obama phrase, that Labour got at the local council elections, the questions have followed, what do we do now? And over the course of the weekend and today in The Guardian, the question was raised about whether it is time to reverse course on the winter fuel allowance cut, which has proved so unpopular up and down the country and has led to a lot of very prominent Labour figures saying, this is the wrong policy, we need to change course.
Yeah, and today we've had confirmation, Keir Starmer's spokesman ruling out any U-turn on the government's deeply unpopular winter fuel payment cuts, despite that widespread anger. And I guess it speaks to a bigger question, doesn't it? Which is whether the government has to hear this anger and say, trust us, we've got it, we know what we're doing, we're going to follow through on this, or whether they hear this anger and say, OK, we're listening, what can we do to reverse it? And I think they're actually caught between both those positions right now. Over the weekend, I was speaking to people, as I'm sure you both were, saying the winter fuel is the easiest thing to U-turn on now. And nobody outside Westminster really cares about a U-turn. They just want to see, the sort of policy corrected, the political mistake corrected. But I think the problem with that is the winter fuel cuts only saves about 1.5 billion. Right? And once you've done that, you've basically slightly shown that you don't really trust Rachel Reeves. It was her first political move as Chancellor. You've opened the door to all the other things that people hate, whether it's the farmers and inheritance tax, whether it's the NIC, which is arguably a much, much bigger taxation problem for them if they reverse that. And I don't think you've put the lid on a wider question, which is, why are you making these sort of individual adjustments that don't really lead to growth? They just upset people. I mean, you called it on Friday the cardinal sin. I would say the original sin that Labour made was coming into government, even in their campaign, ruling out tax rises.
Completely.
Right? And actually, that is the thing that's really overall that is haunting them now. Why tie yourself, when you're 20 points ahead in the polls, to something that would have quietly made all those bigger individual problems go away by just saying, we're going to do this, it's going to be painful, but then it's done. It's done.
I think one of the reasons they're going to be so reluctant to reverse course on winter fuel is partly, as you say, Emily, it doesn't raise very much money. In fact, if they did it now, if they reverse now, it would actually cost them money. Because one of the things that they've done in order to try and say we're listening to you on winter fuel is do an advertising campaign encouraging people who are on pension or credit to sign up for winter fuel. So the net result would be that you don't get rid of the policy, and actually over time you've encouraged more people to sign up to it in the first place, so it would cost you money. But I think the main reason is not that. The main reason would be that they know what they've got coming up in June, which is the parliamentary votes on personal independence payments, which does raise some serious money. The welfare changes that have been announced raise over £5 billion. It is something about which, if anything, Labour MPs are way more uncomfortable, because there was always the intellectual case they could say, look, we're giving 300 quid a year to very rich pensioners. That's not a Labour thing. The extent of unease on the welfare changes, particularly for disabled people, is profound and deep on the Labour benches. So if they retreat on this, then before you've even begun the next parliamentary and political battle, which does raise serious money, then you've basically adverted to your brittleness and your frailty, and they're afraid of doing it.
And then we go back to Tony Blair's question and the question we posed at the top of the episode, which is, do you go to the left, change course, not do what Keir Starmer's promising to do, which is we're listening, but we're going to carry on and do the same things, but just do them quicker. And you've got Blair saying, if people don't want the status quo, why are you doing that? And you have Diane Abbott, the first time probably in history that Diane Abbott has been in the same place as Tony Blair, saying, if you're going in the wrong direction, don't go there quicker. And so sort of you've got
the Unite Union.
Sorry?
And the Unite Union on what Blair said about net zero.
Exactly. And so you've got these very odd alliances taking place. And I don't think that the government does quite know what to do now. And I think there's been a really interesting thing today, which is we heard at the weekend, and Lewis, at the weekend, I think you interviewed Andrea Jenkins, the new mayor of Lincolnshire. Mayor Jenkins, talking about putting people into tents as a way of putting asylum seekers into tents.
If it's good enough for France, it's good enough for us, is what she says.
Yeah.
Which is not something you hear from Reform all the time, it has to be said.
Well, let's hear.
People are struggling. So why should the British people be putting people in hotels out of their own pocket
so
when
you'd be happy
they
to
work
see,
so
you'd be
hard?
happy, you'd be content, as the Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, you can have a role in this. If there are roads with people in with tents, you're content with that.
It's got to be a confined area. I mean, I have to say, this isn't a reform policy.
If there were children, should they be in tents?
The fact is, we've got to stop the pull to Britain with this. And why are we paying these millions and millions of pounds to France when people come from a safe country such as France to come here? We should be sending them back to France.
So if there were children in Lincolnshire, unaccompanied migrants, and they were in tents on the roadside,
well, how are they
your
going to
message
get
is
here
okay.
in the first place?
I know, but once they are here, if they're in a tent, that's okay with you.
What percentage is actually children? Look, the majority of them is actually but the majority is economic migrants, Lewis. They've got the mobile phones. It's usually young men who come across, and we've got to stop this pull to Britain.
And intriguingly, I mean, that we should say that isn't actually reform policy. That's her view. But intriguingly, what does Number 10 in the lobby briefing say today? Not completely ruling out. This is Keir Starmer's government. Not completely ruling out the reform idea of rehousing asylum seekers in tents. PM spokesman says the government always keeps accommodation under review to ensure value for the taxpayer. And I think that shows just that one thing, and you're going to see this rinse and repeat, this dilemma that Number 10 is facing between moving closer to reform and actively rejecting and being seen to articulate and reject their ideas. And you're going to see that on question after question after question. And if they're saying that about something which is actually as deeply controversial as the idea of housing asylum seekers in tents, think about the stuff which actually polls better. That won't poll terribly well with the public. Think about the stuff that polls better and where number 10 goes with that.
Reform are on, I think, a very strong wicket when it comes to housing asylum seekers in hotels. People properly hate that, and they hate the fact that you come out the station and the hotel opposite the station, which might be the Grand Hotel or the old sort of 1930s prestigious hotel where the Queen Mum would have come to stay back in her day, is now the place that is housing asylum seekers.
And it costs a fortune.
And people remember it and sort of think, that's the place that I might have been once to go to a wedding, and I cannot get my head around the fact that this is the main hotel in the main part of our city, and it's housing asylum seekers. I think I think the fact that they have come in over the weekend said, we're going to actually make this a legal challenge, we're going to get rid of all the hotel, we're going to literally take this to the courts. And Labour have responded by saying, do you think we didn't try this? Of course we've tried this. Goes to the heart of the problem now, and it is this, that we all treat reform and their success and their newfound sort of muscularity, we treat them as if they're a new party. And they very much aren't. They are UKIP into Brexit, into Leave, into Reform, with the same leader, the same clothes, the same rhetoric. And I think that this is something that the government would actually do well to remember. If people are sort of saying, well, oh, it's a scream of pain and they're going to provide the answers and they're the ones that are now sort of responding to the fact that we hate the main party politics, Britain is broken. Well, who broke it? It was Farage's Brexit ideas and his Leave campaign. That shrank the economy by 5%. We've got higher legal immigration now than when we were in the EU. We've got a 15% slump in trade. We've got a £40 billion lost tax revenue. I think it's really important that we don't frame reform as this sort of brand new creation of the last 12 months. It isn't. It is the same party that has done so much damage under a different name to this country already.
I do think it's fascinating that, we were talking at the end of last week about the upcoming Australian elections. Labour wins the landslide against a populist Conservative leader, Peter Dutton. We were in Canada at the beginning of last week when, Mark Carney beats Pierre Poilievre, another populist politician. In Britain, we've gone a different way, where we've had elections and the populist politician in the shape of Nigel Farage has done extremely well. I mean, I kind of wonder whether there will be a greater scrutiny now that some of the decisions, when he was campaigning for Brexit, it was a campaign against Brexit which got popular support and people bought into it. They will be running councils now. They will be running council services now. And whether that brings a degree more accountability to them, and we can see, well, okay, we've seen what you've done, where in a sense, Farage can argue, well, we're kind of these political neophytes and we've never really run anything.
Yeah, I mean, how many surgeries has Farage held since he became the Clacton MP, right?
Well, the thing is, I think this question, I think, about accountability and scrutiny on what happens now with reform is interesting. Because on the one level, there will be doing something that they haven't really done before. They're going to be controlling proper county council. I mean, UKIP at its height only ever had Thanet Council, which was a district council, small council. At their height, they only
and Ramsey, actually, it ran Ramsey Council in Cambridgeshire.
Well, a town council.
Parish council.
Parish council, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, but talking about like big, so big authority. Now they've now got 677 councillors after one night. UKIP only had 500 at their peak, which took them 10 years, right? So they're in charge of some serious authorities. But I have to say, I am sceptical of the idea that they will receive that much more enhanced scrutiny that will damage them for a couple of reasons, right? One is, frankly, and this is a sad reason, but it's true, the main vehicle for scrutinising local government in this country historically was local press. Yeah. Local press is in a dire state for reasons people will be familiar with, and you're not going to see, as sad as it might be, you're not going to see, big Westminster-based national publications tracking in any great detail what, say, Staffordshire Council is doing. They don't do it at the moment. I doubt they're going to do it in future. The other reason I'm sceptical about it is, frankly, we've seen this story before with populist parties, right? We've seen populist parties take control of the most prestigious and biggest governments in the world, including the United States. And frankly, often scrutiny over their record is often quite poor in the sense of actually predicting how it will affect voters' behaviour. Because very often, what happens is instead, and this is actually where I think Farage's true political success is coming from at the moment, will continue to come from, they successfully manage to articulate, in this vibes-based politics that we have, manage to articulate the roar of discontent which exists. So it doesn't matter. With Trump, for example, some of his policies we know go catastrophically wrong. It doesn't touch the sides. And if it doesn't touch the sides with Trump, then I struggle to see how it's going to touch the sides with what they're doing in County Durham or in Staffordshire or wherever it happens to be.
Can I just say that I think that we've managed to get 15 minutes into this episode, and that's the first mention of Donald Trump, which I think is a record since January the 20th.
I'll put it into the jar.
But I would say that this comes down to us. This is on us, right? And it's about the way the media frames these parties as well, because I just think we're in danger of saying, wow, people are listening. This is brand new. They realise that everyone's fallen out of love with the main parties. All of that is true. But just this framing that they have got the offer that no one else has, I think is really wrong. And actually, if you look at the polling that's coming out of what's happened to reform, is people are saying, yeah, I want to kick the government. Yeah, I'm furious with winter fuel. I'm furious with the NICs. I'm furious with the fact that the Conservatives have just sort of imploded on my doorstep and they barely look like a proper party anymore. I don't think they're in love with Farage. And I think that is going to be critical. I mean, it's really interesting, actually. I was looking at some of Luke Trill's sort of assessment in the last 48 hours, and they say, when you vote in a local elections, what do you care about most? The 50% number is, guess what? Like half the issue that is potholes, right? Roads and potholes are the things that 50% of the people say that they vote for in a local election. When you ask reform voters what they're voting for, 67% say a change in immigration. So it's almost like people are having two different elections, right? If you vote reform, you're thinking on a national level of national interests, and immigration is going to be the most salient one. If you're used to voting in local elections for the party that is in control, you think about how you're driving your car and whether you're going to end up with a burnt tire, bust up tires. And I just think this to my point, this comes down to us, right? We cannot just frame them as finally there's a party coming that seems to offer people the solutions because they're talking about X, Y, Z. We've never seen Nigel Farage in any of his guises solve any of the problems that he has talked about. And he's not a neophyte. He's been in British politics for 30, 40 decades.
Although I do think
30, 40
feels
years.
Like it. Although I do think, to be fair, that there are a couple of differences in this incarnation of Farage, right? Which is, obviously you're right. He has haunted. He's been around in British politics forever. He's ridden similar waves before. I think that there's two key differences, right? This is the first time that he has managed to actually properly kind of nationalise his party, in the sense that he is being successful without the European question. Yeah. Right? Every other time, whether it's Brexit Party or UKIP, it was basically still about Europe. We know that because after Brexit, what happened to UKIP? It just dissolved. It disappeared, right? This is the first time Farage is managing to be successful without that kind of adhesive. And then the other thing is that, just from Labour's point of view here, in terms of how they respond, he has moved politically in terms of what he is offering, not on cultural questions and so on, but certainly on the question of the economy, right? He has become way more statist. You compare Farage now with Farage of, say, 2014, when he was at his last peak. He was basically still, an unreconstructed Thatcherite libertarian, right? Yeah. Now he's going around saying, let's nationalise British steel.
But
let's
what are your answers?
Unions.
That's the point. What is your proven track record? Your proven track record after Brexit was the list that I've just read out, right? An absolutely sunken economy.
Yeah, and
nobody is saying, well, hang on a second, you were at the forefront, you were at the vanguard of that entire campaign, and look at it now. Because what does he say? We're not doing Brexit properly.
I think, let's spool forward to a general election, and whether we'll see whether Labour has sorted out its identity crisis and whether it's found a way of dealing with reform. Yeah. But I do think then the questions, if we're sort of talking about our next Prime Minister, not talking about local council elections, but who will be in number 10 Downing Street, the relationship that Farage has with Trump, I'm sure he's going to try and put more distance between him and Trump if the chaos goes on.
Trump might be gone by then. Presumably he's gone by then because he's had his 4 years within a parliamentary term.
His stance over Ukraine and some of the kind of pro-Russia comments that he's made in the past as well, well, possibly.
Oh, I see. You're saying that his relationship with Trump works against him for the British people.
Yes, I think it does, and I think his relationship with Putin and taking Putin's side also works.
But did you notice that other day that he did an interview with Beth Rigby at Sky, and he was already started putting distance. This is where he's supple, right? When he was asked about Trump, he said, which I don't think he would have said about a month ago. He said, well, of course, I'm massively supportive on some of the domestic stuff, particularly on what's going on in the border. It's done great stuff stopping immigration, but all this foreign policy stuff with Putin, Ukraine, and with Canada, what's all that about?
Because
he would not have said that a month ago.
No,
he lost. Don't forget, he lost the Mail over his stance on Putin. The Mail hates Farage because they think he's too close to Russia. And actually, I don't think a future Prime Minister can afford to be actually hated by the Daily Mail. That's another question.
Makes life more difficult.
It does.
But the question is about Labour, right? And the central question, it seems to me, of how Starmer responds, because you mentioned the Canada and Australia examples, John. You could imagine a sort of quote unquote progressive party government articulating a message that is similar-ish to what they've done, which is to lean in to some of their liberalism, to lean in to the sort of anti-Trump agenda, to lean in to the anti-nationalist kind of agenda. Starmer is going to struggle to do that, or clearly doesn't want to do that, for a few reasons. Practically, he's not in an election right now and he wants to deal with Trump, so he doesn't want to kind of be seen to be,
He
centre
can't be
his
too Ed
politics.
Davey.
No, exactly. He can't centre his politics, or he doesn't feel like he wants to centre his politics around that. But there's another reason as well, right, which is that he's got a big part of the Labour Party in its bones, right, deep down, even though its MPs have become more middle class and more bourgeois and whatever, in its bones, it continues to see itself as the party of working people, of working class people, and it does not want to. It can't stand at the moment. There's a stat that came out over the weekend showing that before these elections, Labour used to represent 85% of the most deprived wards in Britain. If you take the ones that were changed hands last week, now Reform represent 80+%, and Labour's 10%. Labour increasingly, and this is a long story that predates Starmer, it's been going on for 10 years. Labour has becoming increasingly, same thing with Democrats. Exactly, they've become more. They have the party base has become more university educated, more public sector, and actually, the Labour Party kind of hates that. Actually, a lot of the Labour Party still deep down does not like that.
Although I think actually more middle class people are going now to Farage, right? I mean, that is also what has started.
Well, his coalition is getting bigger, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you are a disillusioned Tory who hates woke, you can be as rich as the hills and love what Reform is doing right now. I don't think it's just working class anymore. I mean, that is the definition, obviously, of success is when your coalition grows both ways, right?
But I think this is. I mean, Nigel Lawson, you say, Thatcher's Chancellor said that the party which wins the battle of ideas wins elections. And I think that for the progressive side of politics right now, and for Starmer's for the future of the Labour government is that this is the dilemma. You can cling close to what Farage is doing, and actually thereby often validating his arguments
completely.
But if you're not contesting, and we've seen this play out in lots of other countries as well.
Totally.
If you're not right now, it feels
if you're
to me
not contesting them, why don't you just become them?
The battle of ideas right now, it feels to me, is not being contested. Right, there is not, with the possible exception of some of the smaller parties, there is not a, for want of a better expression, progressive, liberal articulation of why Farage is wrong.
Better than the tents thing. I mean,
yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Why you can't just come out and say we think it's an aberration. It's against. It's a bit like saying, "Oh yeah, I'm so pleased we painted over Mickey Mouse."
We're not putting kids in tents. That's a lie.
And we don't want Mickey Mouse in the asylum. Welcome
so
centre.
First thing you've got to do is you've got to work out what the argument is
and what you're about.
And what you're about. The next thing, and you kind of hear it from Blair at that first, playing 30 seconds of Tony Blair. He can frame an argument so brilliant.
Just say it.
Just say it clearly and think, oh, that's clever. That's engaging. I get that. And I don't think there is anyone in the government who can quite communicate. I mean, maybe it's because they haven't got a clear idea of what they're doing that it feels so woolly and unclear. But you need somebody who can marshal the argument and make it to the British people. At the moment, it feels that isn't being done.
I think it's that they don't like. I mean, I've never wondered if Farage liked talking to the media and liked talking to the voter.
I don't think he minds it.
I don't think he minds it. Whereas there aren't that many people on the Labour front bench who I think they're dying to come out and talk to us.
No, that's the thing, John. You put your finger up. Basically, the question right now is, it feels like, in terms of, partly because Starmer actively dislikes ideas, he actually dislikes the kind of conceptualisation of politics. He finds it woolly.
I don't mind that. I don't mind if you don't like ideas, but you have to have a story. If you haven't got ideas, you've got to have a story.
And especially if you're up against an opponent who does have a potent story, whether it is based in right or wrong. And the point is if you're not clear what you're about, and then you haven't got many people who can articulate it, then you've got a problem. And that is what we keep coming up against, or they keep coming up against at the moment.
In a moment, we'll be talking about what is happening in Gaza and the Netanyahu plan to take over Gaza as a whole.
So last night came news that the Israeli government cabinet had approved a plan by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, who, let's not forget, is in the middle of his own political trial, physically legal trial. He's on his 28th day of giving testimony. But the cabinet has now approved plans to occupy all of Gaza, stay there for an indeterminate period, and they will now put at risk the livelihood of just about everybody living in Gaza. 2 million people who will now be displaced and possibly starved if food doesn't get through, because there has been a blockade on humanitarian aid getting through for the last 60 days since March, since essentially the end of that first phase of the so-called peace plan, which was releasing hostages and has now come to a very bitter, devastating end.
And on the back of that announcement, Hamas have today said there is no point in continuing with ceasefire talks, peace talks, now that Israel has declared so blatantly what it wants to do, which means that if you are a Palestinian scrabbling around for food, what was already a dire situation seems even bleaker now. Donald Trump has said he'll make efforts to get food into Gaza, but says there are all sorts of bad people out there, by which he's referring to Hamas predominantly, as they're kind of stealing all the food and storing it for their fighters, something that Hamas absolutely denies.
I don't think you can overestimate just how bleak the humanitarian situation in Gaza is right now. The blockade, as Emily was saying, has started on the 2nd of March. It's now the 6th of May. Israel shut all crossings into Gaza on that date. That prevented all goods, including food, fuel and medicines, from entering. At the same time, resuming its 2 weeks later its military offensive, ending the 2-month ceasefire with Hamas. And the UN, and basically the only reason that Gazans haven't starved already, or got very close to it, is because of the remaining largely UN-led humanitarian NGO food programs, which are using and have been using the food which got in before the blockade started. And they have warned in the last couple of days that the food that they do have will run out within the next 2 weeks. That was 4 days ago. So we were looking at being 10 days, 9 days away from starvation in the Gaza Strip.
And Israel, I mean, you know, this is the question, isn't it? How on earth can you justify starving a population to death, which is something that I think we have been asking and looking at now for months. And Israel has basically tried to justify it by saying, oh, well, actually, when we send stuff in, Hamas is stealing goods, you know, they're taking stuff, they're diverting stuff away from civilians, and they're trying to use it to pressure Hamas. Hamas has basically come out overnight in an interview, as you were saying, John, which is saying, well, what's the point of us agreeing to a ceasefire for 2 days? You know, what's the point of us agreeing to anything when actually we know that the fighting will start again and you will inflict the same amount of pain? And it is, I suppose, extraordinary that now Hamas has said overnight in an interview, what's the point of us, you know, releasing, what's the point of us talking about peace when we just think that the fighting's going to start up, 2 days later, 4 days later. What Israel's saying is that they will hire private companies to distribute aid, which then frees up its soldiers. We should also say that they have now called upon their reservists to go in and fight this war. And I think there is a real question mark over what Israeli reserve soldiers think to this. You know, do they want to be part of this plan that literally, I mean, it's a totally different way now of fighting Gaza. This is not about hitting Hamas or hitting the so-called tunnels or trying to extinguish the terrorists. This is literally about displacement and annexation and a permanent position, a permanent military position throughout the whole of Gaza.
Yeah, and the question would have to be raised, if you are going to displace these people, displace them to where? Yeah. Who is going to want to take in 2 million Palestinians for whom Gaza is their home? The other thing about it is the politics of this, of why Netanyahu is doing it. You spoke a moment ago, Emily, about the fact that he is facing these corruption charges and that trial trundles on. There are an awful lot of people who are saying this is not about getting the hostages out. This actually will endanger those few remaining poor souls who were taken on October the 7th. It's about Netanyahu's political survival. How long can I stay in the saddle for? If I create a situation of near permanent war, that is my best way of staying, in control.
Well, out of jail.
Well, we're joined now by Dahlia Scheindlin, who is a public opinion researcher in Israel, a pollster, political strategist, author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, and part of an independent think tank, the Century Foundation. Dahlia, thank you so much for being with us. We have heard what Benjamin Netanyahu has said that he wants to do in terms of annexing Gaza. Where does the Israeli public stand on that idea?
I think the Israeli public breaks with Netanyahu and the government in a number of ways. But first and foremost, the majority of the Israeli public consistently, in every survey that's been asked since the beginning of the war, believes that the motivations driving the prime minister and his decision-making with relation to the war, particularly to continue the war and not reach an end to the war through a hostage deal, is motivated by his personal political considerations. So before we even try to assess what the Israeli public actually thinks about reoccupying, annexing Gaza, the first thing to keep in mind is that the majority believe he is doing this for the wrong reasons, and that is to protect his political situation. That majority can range between 53%, something we saw in a survey that was conducted just yesterday by Channel 13, up to in the mid 60% range. So the lack of trust characterizes a majority of Israelis for whichever decision he's making. And I think that the other point to keep in mind is that the majority of Israelis, again, most surveys show between 60 and 70% would have preferred to prioritize getting the hostages back, including when that means ending the war and withdrawing Israeli forces from Gaza. So by implication, they don't support expanding the war, certainly not annexing Gaza, but that raises such a whole different set of questions about the long-term future of Israel that it is a different issue. And we know from earlier survey research in the beginning of the war that certainly there is no majority of Israelis who support it, only a minority. But I don't think at that stage, in October and November 2023, Israelis were really internalizing what it would mean to permanently reoccupy Gaza, annex Gaza, take on full Israeli responsibility for 2 million people, notwithstanding the fact that the government, of course, wants to reduce the number of people in Gaza by essentially transferring or pressuring Palestinians to leave. Israelis will have to internalize that effectively means permanent war and insurgency.
How much do Israelis know about what is actually going on in Gaza? How aware are they of the scale of the suffering and of the humanitarian crisis and of people being on the brink of starvation now? Do you feel that this is within the media, at home in Israel? Is this shown? Is this talked about? Is this discussed?
Certainly, Israelis are not seeing the level of suffering and destruction in Gaza as much as the international community is through the international media. The pictures, the visuals are not shown in the same way and at the same level. And that's why Israelis remain throughout the last year and a half sort of confused about why the entire world sees Israel as a perpetrator of great destruction and violence when they believe they're simply doing the necessary amounts to defend the country after October 7th. However, I think at this point, there's no real way that Israelis cannot know. Whether or not they see the actual images on television is a bit beside the point. Every Israeli has a smartphone. Every Israeli has social media. Every Israeli is aware of the accusation that the war has gone way beyond what it would need for self-defense to prevent against another October 7th, and has become devastating to civilian life, caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths. Israelis do know that. The number 50,000 killed in this war has been repeated any number of times. The fact that there is a debate over whether Gazans are starving or whether there is genocide is a debate that is happening in Israel as well. And so some people deny it, but there's no illusion that those are the questions on the table. And I think you'd have to make a real effort not to know that those are the problems with the war in Gaza at this point.
And Dahlia, I suppose the flip side of what you've just described in terms of polling numbers is that there are 35 to 45% of Israelis who are utterly comfortable with what Netanyahu is doing and believe him to be the one person who is properly defending Israel's interests.
That's true. That's, as you very accurately pointed out, 35 to 40% is not a majority. Now, that doesn't mean that a government can make decisions based on polling, right? The government did win the elections according to Israel's electoral system in November 2022. And so on the one hand, you have, a pretty firm basis of support, which is a minority, but it's a significant minority, and that's only in surveys. The government legitimately won those elections, so it can continue what it wants to do. And there is a lot of public pressure. There's a great deal of talk about, the possibility that people won't show up for reserve duty, and the response rate to reserve draft orders has been declining, and there are demonstrations on the street. But ultimately, as you point out, that government has its core of support. Polling is only polling. There's no legal mechanism to turn either demonstrations or public opinion studies into policy. They don't topple governments. And this government has survived some of its biggest challenges that could have toppled, this or any government. Most governments in Israel don't usually last a full 4-year term. But the government has survived most of those challenges primarily because the coalition parties are well aware that their polls are poor. They don't have that majority. They have not been able to win a majority in any public poll except for their kind of crony pollsters. But all of the legitimate polling in Israel shows that they cannot win a majority ever since, frankly, January 2023, even before the war. And therefore, the parties have made a lot of compromises along the way with each other in order to stay in power. And as a result, between those 2 points, the fact that the coalition has stabilized itself, it's even added some new figures. And as you point out, there is a core of support, even if it's not a majority in surveys. The government looks like it is perfectly set to move ahead with these plans. And it's very hard to see what can actually, stop the government from moving ahead with the plans that were just announced and approved by the cabinet over the last couple of days, which have been more explicit than ever about Israel's intention to occupy, capture, and eventually move towards annexation of Gaza, parts or all of Gaza.
Well, I guess one thing that does stop that plan is if reservists simply refuse to serve. I mean, what happens to them if they say, I'm not going to fight, not in my name, I'm not fighting this war?
Yeah, I mean, I would not count on the level of refusal that you would need to actually impede the war effort. In other words, think about the fact that even according to army sources, we had, well over 100% response rate to the draft orders in the first days of the war when everybody was shocked by October 7th. The army sources say that has declined to about 75%, but anecdotally, if you talk to officers, it might be even lower depending on which unit you're talking about. And still, there are enough people who are very, very highly motivated and still see this as a war of survival, as an existential war, as a war of absolutely necessary war of defense, that they will continue coming. And therefore, the question is how I simply don't see response rate to reserve draft orders dropping as far as they would need to drop to really stop these plans. Now, what happens to those people? The army has any number of ways of dealing with them. When people are called up, if they don't want to go or if they can't go, the army can decide not to make a symbol or a public statement out of this. They can decide that they give individuals, a sort of exemption, even though they were called up, if the people, if those individuals claim that they have a difficult family situation or a difficult economic situation, or for whatever reason, the army can transfer them to a different position within their reserve duty. On the other hand, they can also send them to military prison. They can be court-martialed and sent to military prison. So I don't think the army is necessarily prepared for what to do if there is such a mass number that they can't absorb them, because it hasn't happened yet. I mean, there is, again, a lot of anecdotal observation of the declining number, but I don't think we're seeing anything like mass rates that you would need for either impeding the war at this point or having, a serious problem with having to court-martial mass numbers of people who are not showing up.
Look, you said a moment ago to Emily about the coverage in Israel of what is going on in Gaza, and it's very different from what we're seeing here in Britain or you're seeing in most of the rest of the world. Is that because you're seeing a kind of decline in some of the democratic institutions that hold people to account, whether it be civil society, which is under pressure, whether it be TV stations, whether it be an independent judiciary? People held up Israel as this beacon of democracy in the Middle East. Is that being chipped away?
Well, it's certainly being chipped away, unrelated to how Israelis consume the news about the war. I mean, for those who are interested in my book, I mean, I argue that Israel's democratic foundations have always been weak and even involved missing pillars that just were never there to begin with. And that is because there are deep contradictions in the nature of Israeli politics and society that undermine democracy that Israel has never wanted to resolve. Naturally, the occupation of 1967 to the present has been a major factor, but it started way before that. On this weak foundation, you have a very concerted effort to kind of mimic what we see as the populist illiberal forces around the world who are attacking the judiciary and civil society and free media, certainly under Netanyahu's rule from 2009 onward, accelerating as he fell under corruption investigation and then indictment. People should remember that he is currently standing trial. He was even in court today for the 28th day testifying in his own corruption trials. And so all of that has, chipped away might be a kind way of saying it. I would say more like hacked away at the already fairly weak institutions of Israeli democracy. Now, add to that a situation of war. War is not salutary for democracy. Usually, democratic, rights and democratic practice suffers under wartime, and that is exactly what we're seeing here. We've seen it through, again, accelerated efforts to cramp civil society and the media, legislation to chip away at things like due process and civil liberties, and of course attempts to, accelerate stacking public service with political loyalists and continue undermining the judiciary. So all of that is definitely happening and has been accelerated under the war, and it will be very hard to recover, not to mention the fact that annexation of Gaza, we should also talk about the West Bank, means extending a permanent military authoritarian regime over millions of Palestinian civilians. Is that the reason why Israelis are not sufficiently watching what's going on in Gaza? Actually, I'm not sure. I think that, to be completely honest, after October 7th, I think that the editorial decisions reflected the appetite of the Israeli consumer, which was very little for understanding Palestinian suffering.
And as things stand, Dahlia, when this territory is seized, when this population is displaced, Netanyahu has as good as admitted that the 24 remaining living hostages will not survive. Presumably, that is no longer enough to remove him from power. I mean, there were days when the Israeli government and army would go all out to rescue just one hostage. That's gone now.
Well, I think you have to look at it with a mixture of cold calculations. It's one thing to go all out to rescue one hostage because it is possible to go all out and rescue one hostage. Technically, militarily, operationally, there has been no real way for military raids to recover what was originally 251 hostages scattered throughout and very deeply hidden inside, anywhere between family homes and tunnels way underground in Gaza. So the idea that military operations could actually free most of the hostages was never something that could be implemented. I should also make a little bit of a correction for the sake of, honoring the families. There are 59 Israelis or people who are captured in Israel and Gaza. Some of them are dead. And so their families, of course, are desperate to have their bodies back for burial. We think there are 24 people, although the prime minister's wife also indicated there may be fewer than 24 people alive, which caused a scandal in Israel the other day because the government hasn't given that information to the families. So keep that in mind. But the question about whether that's no longer enough to motivate Israelis to topple the government, it becomes a cynical institutional question in a way, because what can the public do? Let's say the public does not tolerate the government's complacency on this. And they don't. Again, we have polls showing that 70, even as high as 73%, according to a poll by the Israel Democracy Institute, would have supported a hostage release deal that involved a full cessation of the war and withdrawal of forces from Gaza, findings that have been broadly affirmed in every survey since the hostage deal went into effect in mid-January. What can the Israeli public do about it? Surveys don't determine public policy or topple governments. demonstrations, even mass demonstrations. We've had demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people. Do not topple governments. There's no legal mechanism for turning a street demonstration into a coalition crack-up. The only thing that really seems to put significant pressure on the government, which we saw during 2023, is a general strike. And that really shuts down the economy and costs the country a huge amount of money every single day. But it has not been a tool that Israelis were able to leverage during this war. There was one attempt after 6 hostages were executed in the tunnels, and on September, I believe it was August or September of 2024, and the major labor federation tried to call a general strike. The government took them to court, and the labor court ruled that the strike could not really go on beyond a very limited number of hours because it was considered political. And so this is an indicator of how hard it is to actually undertake action that puts material pressure or real leverage on the government. And there's lots of people who are calling for that. Very prominent public figures or former leaders, including former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and numerous other figures who have said, the public should really have a huge national strike. What does that mean in practice? Yeah. Can it be done in a way that truly shuts down the country, as people like to say, for sloganeering, but that is very hard to implement in practice?
Dahlia, it's been incredible talking to you. Thank you so much. It's been, very, very enlightening. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Mit Ja haben gestimmt 310 der Abgeordneten, mit Nein haben gestimmt 307.
That is the moment that the man we all thought by now would be Germany's next chancellor failed to win the number of seats required to get him through. It was, you can't tell from the German perhaps, but it was quite a moment because he failed by 6 votes. It all seems to be about 6 votes nowadays, doesn't it? And that means he came short of gaining a parliamentary majority that he needs to become the country's next leader.
Yeah, and it all seems like it was a kind of classic miscalculation. He needed 316 votes, he got 310 votes, and it seemed there was a bit of skullduggery of people trying to be too clever by half, and ending up with undermining Merz's position before he even becomes Chancellor. Presumably...
The James Cleverly phenomenon.
The James Cleverly phenomenon.
Yep.
So we're going to do it in cod German accents as well.
Yeah.
We haven't had enough of that. I mean, I love it. The first time we do a German story on here for about 2 months, and we're already going down the Fawlty Towers route. I think it's worth just trying to analyse what is going on behind this, because yes, it might have been a Cleverly thing, but I think that it kicked off yesterday when he signed the coalition deal with the SPD, the sort of left, the Social Democrats, the left of centre party, and he did this partly because he basically has to work with them to free up the money that they now need, to ramp up borrowing to spend on defence. And I think a lot of people were like, oh, hang on, I'm not really sure that we want, the Conservatives, as it were, the Christian Democrats working with the SPD in that way, which started to give people a sense that he already didn't have a very strong basis for this coalition government.
And look, I mean, they brought forward an emergency second vote later today. So by the time you're listening to this, it is in fact possible that Merz might be Chancellor.
Yes.
But the point is to say that this is really, really unusual. Like to British ears, used as we are to kind of slightly mad parliamentary chicanery, this might seem relatively fine and normal. It doesn't usually happen like this in German politics. This has in fact never happened before. It has never happened since 1945, since the foundation of then West Germany, that an incoming German Chancellor has lost a vote to form his government at the first time of asking, because this is always normally just a completely boring, done deal. In fact, it's even been put to SPD party members who have signed it off. So what it adverts to, even if Merz is Chancellor by the end of the day or by the end of the week, he'll probably get there. But what it adverts to is how potentially fractious and weak his government might be even before it started, which, given when you think about the problems that are taking place in the EU right now, in Germany itself, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, breathing down their neck, already calling for new elections, it shows that Germany's problems might not be at an end.
I mean, Merz was meant to be, I think, meeting Macron today in France.
Tomorrow in Paris.
Yeah, exactly.
He might still get there, but
he might. Yeah, yesterday's news tomorrow. But we will basically understand from that he did not expect for one moment this not to go through. But I also wonder if it points to a bigger problem, which is not today's problem, but it might be coming at us more widely over elections in the future, because Germany has this kind of cordon sanitaire, right? It says all the parties will work together to shut out the extreme parties of the far right, the AfD in this case. I just wonder how long that can hold for. I wonder how long.
Well, it's already been tested.
It's already been tested. I mean, in Germany, they're kind of saying, yeah, we will do anything but work with the AfD. What happens when you see sort of other European countries around the world? I mean, Austria's done the same thing. You end up inevitably getting these quite strange bedfellows with the governing party, because they don't really like each other. They just all hate another party more.
And inevitably, because of the kind of Merz not getting across the line today, you've had the AfD saying, well, there should be fresh elections. We need to have fresh elections. Of course, it's a great populist rallying call for them to be able to say, look, the system is broken. I think the marginalisation of the AfD is time limited. I just don't think it. Yeah, I do. I think they'll have to find a way of bringing them in from the cold.
Well, they were classified as
by German
extreme right, by German
intelligence.
intelligence. At the weekend, they were classified nationally as an extreme right organisation.
And
Marco Rubio came out and said,
"Don't do it."
They're working against democracy. They're working.
The American Secretary of State getting involved in something like that.
But I mean, you look at what's happened. Also, is this a moment to mention Romania over the weekend, where you might remember they basically cancelled the last round of elections because they said that the far-right candidate had been propelled into that position by Russian propaganda, by Putin's help, by kind of the selling, essentially, of votes. And what happened? Well, they held the first round at the weekend. And George Simeon, who is the kind of new candidate of the hard right, back in first place. I mean, it's only the first round of two, but maybe they are fighting this tide, and it's hard to see how long
I think what it feels like, the thing that links all of these things, right? Whether it's Britain, what we're talking about at the start, France, which will be in 2027, obviously Germany as well. It just feels in polity after polity, country after country, you're basically seeing the old remaining kind of mainstream political forces being given a final chance to actually make the system work.
Yeah.
And increasingly voters feeling that they're failing to succeed. And that is very much the feeling in Germany right now, that this SPD, CDU, centre-left, centre-right alliance, which has worked together before, but under Merz, it is its last attempt.
Which goes back to Blair.
To secure
which is,
things.
It's not enough just to say we are the party of government.
Or that we're mainstream and we're normal and they're not, because increasingly they are normal. Increasingly they have been normalised.
And they're perceived as normal.
Yeah,
exactly.
Indeed.
They've been normalised. Can I just say that on our morning call this morning, I was proposing, after my weekend in Guernsey at the Literary Festival there, that I was going to talk about Guernsey politics and the bailiwick of Guernsey.
Give us one.
We don't say bailiwick enough on this show.
We don't say bailiwick, exactly. We don't.
Not enough.
Is it bailiwick?
Or ballywick. How are your ballywicks?
Well, now we've got down to the pronunciation. We're not going to talk about the politics of Guernsey at all. I can see this is going to have to wait for another episode.
Live show in St. Peter's Port?
Oh, I'm up for that.
Yeah.
I think emergency episode is the phrase that we're missing here now.
Cobo Beach is lovely. We'll do the live show there. Okay,
lovely.
Goodbye.
Bye.
See you soon, Guernsey.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.